Hey, well, hello everyone. This is Ryan Anderson with the IPM Institute and the North Central School IPM Working Group, as well as Pest Defense, which is the main product for the North Central IPM Working Group, free online training for more than 10 different occupations within schools. And we're continuing these interviews of state IPM laws or just IPM laws in general. These interviews are funded, of course, by the North Central Integrated Pest Management Center and the USDA. And so we appreciate having this funding to continue to look into effective state school IPM laws. Today we have Seth Dibblee, who's the environmental scientist for Integrated Pest Management at EPA Region 5. We're very excited to have Seth. He's been very involved in IPM across the North Central region as well as nationally. So thank you for joining us, Seth. And if you could give us a little overview of yourself and your role at the EPA, as well as what you do in terms of engagement with school IPM.
Okay, well, thank you, Ryan. I'm glad to be here. As you mentioned, I am an environmental scientist in the pesticides program at US EPA in Region 5. Region 5 is the sort of the Great Lakes region of EPA. We have 6 states that we pay attention to: Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. I'm sorry, Ohio and Minnesota. Did I miss them all? Michigan. You'd think I'd remember all these, right? I have been with the pesticides program since 2008, so it's been a little while. I started in pesticides as for agricultural IPM, and then in 2010, 2011, I can't remember exactly when our resources were shifted from ag IPM to school IPM. So I was involved with school IPM from that shift, and of course, school IPM has sort of matured at EPA, and most of the programming is more or less complete. We have a center of expertise in our Region 6 office that fields most of the routine activities. So I don't do quite the work in schools that I did once upon a day, but I'm still the primary contact for that. And I have colleagues in each of the other regions who do the same thing. The other things that I do at EPA are I work with 2 states, Minnesota and Indiana, on their state pesticide regulatory programs. And then I work with registration review and special registrations under Section 18 and Section 24C of the pesticide law. So that's sort of the genesis, or the short version of my background on school IPM.
Yeah, I'm interested. You said it matured after 2011. Was that due to, I'm assuming there's some sort of law or policy that had you a lot focused on school IPM in 2011, or was it something else of why you were so focused in 2011? And also going on that, what was the reason for the change?
Good question. And I wish I could remember the name of the assistant administrator, but in 2010, we were at the pesticides program was asked to make an investment in children's health. And at that time, I was with the Strategic Ag Initiative, and that was also sort of wrapping up. It was kind of reaching its it wasn't done, but it was sort of reaching its maturity, and it had completed just about all it was set out to do. So this was a kickoff to contribute to children's health. I'll have to find the guy's name who actually made the decision. We had resources in each region, one person in each region, and then there was a special dispensation for staff to have a center of expertise or a center of excellence outside of headquarters. And so in order to get those work years, and I think there were 4 work years, EPA set up that office in Dallas, and that office is still in existence. You may be familiar with Thomas, who's the team leader, and then there's several others who work for him on a national basis. So during that, beginning in 2011, we set up a series of things, a series of resources for schools to implement IPM, and we did some retail work, so to speak, where we were on the ground with schools and with our states, but we also set up some national repositories. So the very first Pest Defense training was part of that process. It's had several iterations since then, and you know all about that. We also had a repository of all kinds of resources based on pests and roles and locality, and that was the Stop School Pests website, and Don Gouge in Arizona was instrumental in that, as was Janet in Texas. We have a webinar series that continues. Started back in 2011, and it's been going on ever since. Usually every once a month during the school year, about 9 or 10 webinars a year on various topics. There have been some repeats over the years, but we have the webinar series. We have a series of publications that are now available on the web. We have we had contractor support to develop the business case for school IPM, as well as the science behind school IPM. So setting up those things, setting up what do I call them? Policy templates for schools that are looking for tools in order to implement their own school policy. We had a lot of those things are on the website and actually still there and still current. Probably the biggest single sort of swan song for the program was the School IPM Summit, where we had stakeholders from national organizations across the country meet several years ago. And I want to say that was 2014 or 2015 to sort of endorse the school IPM as a practice for school health. But once all of that has been set up, it's kind of steady as she goes now. There is a recognition program for schools that are successful. The recognition program hasn't gotten as far as we'd like, because there's concern. There's always concern at EPA when we try and recognize somebody. You want to make sure that it turns out not to be an endorsement, where we're not allowed to make endorsements as federal employees. So there's that's sort of unrealized piece. But otherwise, the program is fairly mature now after 10, 12 years.
Mm-hmm. And so you mentioned the recognition program. Is there any other like metrics that you're tracking, like how many schools use your resources for their own school IPM?
Marcia Anderson tracks all of the webinar enrollments and all of the follow-ups that she does from there, the number of clicks that we get on our website. So she does some of the analytics there as well. I don't do them myself, and I don't know the very latest, but yes, there are some metrics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm very interested, of course. You cover the North Central region. And you mentioned Michigan, Indiana, Wisconsin. I know you said your involvement with school IPM has been since 2011. It hasn't been as detailed, but are you still monitoring those state laws and school IPM adoption? If so, is there any states in your region that you would say have like the strongest school IPM laws or the most school IPM adoption? And if so, what does that kind of look like?
Okay, I can tell you this: every state in Region 5 is different, and part of that has to do with the nature of politics, the nature of government programs in each state. And some are more further along than others, although I don't see any of the states that have any deficiencies per se. I have 2 states that actually have school IPM legislation. That's Illinois and Michigan. And you might be familiar with Illinois. You know, the Midwest Pesticide Action Coalition, MPAC, was really involved back in the day in getting that legislation through Congress, through the Illinois State House, and passed. And so that really is an exemplary effort in Illinois. In Illinois, every school is required to practice integrated pest management and green cleaning. They're required to have a plan on file. They're also required to take training if they don't have a plan, and keep taking training until they get a plan done. So I mean, there's quite a bit of carrot and stick in Illinois to make sure that IPM takes place. And if there's ever a complaint or an incident in a school about pesticide use in a school, the first thing that the inspector responding to that complaint does is asks, show me the IPM plan. And it should be it should be available in every building and building specific. So I don't think Illinois gets that many complaints about pesticide use, but it is probably the strongest program of the, from the legal and the policy side. Michigan has had a school IPM law for quite some time, including a mandatory training thing. And it was dormant for a while. It was very active earlier, in the early 2000s. But then the staffer who was the champion for it retired, and then Michigan has had budgetary issues all along. However, last year, Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development got a standing increase in their funding to do to provide services to the underserved citizens in Michigan. And so they have been able to revive their IPM program. And so that they're just getting that underway this year. I've been working with the staffer in Michigan. In fact, we are on October 30th. We're going to go to a school in southwestern Michigan, a short distance from Chicago, and do a walkthrough and walk around, because we haven't done one of those in a long time in Michigan. So that's a success story in Michigan. They have some new funding, and they're doing, starting up again. Indiana and Ohio both have specific rules about pesticide use in schools. Ohio had an optional rule for IPM in schools, but it was kind of an all or nothing thing, and I believe it got sunset, so it's no longer in effect. But both Indiana and Ohio require that pesticides be applied in schools by licensed applicators only, and not by janitors, not by teachers, not by people in the kitchen, but licensed applicators, and only when kids are not there. And those are the two probably biggest single features that are important in IPM, is to minimize the use of pesticides, and especially when the kids aren't there. Wisconsin also has that same requirement, that pesticides can only be applied in schools by licensed applicators, and only when only when the kids are not there, unless there's an emergency. An emergency is typically a stinging insect, dangerously close to a building. We know that stinging insects tend to mind their own business, but if they are disrupted on a playground or in a schoolyard or near an entrance to the building, they do present a risk to kids getting stung, or if any of the kids have an allergy. So that's about the extent of an emergency. And in Wisconsin, they do not have a law or policy about IPM in schools, but the University of Wisconsin Extension has support for supports IPM for schools that want to undertake IPM in Wisconsin. And then Minnesota had a short-term law for IPM in schools, and it remains the policy in Minnesota, but that law, the authority has since has since gone away. It was in effect for 2 years. It was named after somebody who either passed away or who was an important, influential person about it. So IPM is in practice in Minnesota schools, but it doesn't have the legal oomph that you might have in Illinois or Michigan. I think I've covered them all.
Yeah, well, it's a very good synopsis, and it seems like you mentioned each of those states. So is most of your work at the EPA consulting with the individual departments involved with school IPM within the state, or is it more on the ground in terms of going to these schools? What is your role kind of in that?
It's a little of each.
Okay.
In the case of Michigan, the new staffer has not actually done a school walkthrough before or a walk around. So my visit there is kind of a retail visit. We'll be actually on the ground with the school, but trying to build some capacity so that Emily knows, how to go about it and what to do next. So that's so it is retail, but it's intended to be, sort of more of a training exercise for them. And so I end up with the other states. I haven't had that much contact recently, but whenever a question arises, if I get a citizen call, for example, I can provide the citizen, with some names and some phone numbers and some web resources if they have an issue in their school. So there's clearly some options there. We have a network of experts in all the states where we can make referrals when we have a complaint or a concern.
Yeah, and I guess I would say the other question. So you mentioned parents. Do you think the major drive for these schools to adopt IPM is to comply with state laws, or do you think it's also kind of on the ground, like advocacy, like a parent or anything like that is trying to advise them to adopt these IPM practices?
Well, that's another good question, and it's probably I would say it's a mixed bag. Clearly, schools have a lot of stakeholders and a lot of regulatory requirements and people that they listen to, and they want to be compliant with whatever the regulations that are applicable. But in the case of the state, the State Department of Agriculture, they're going to be that's probably going to be lower on the list in terms of compliance unless there's an incident or a complaint. I think that these days, although compliance is a factor, I think these days what's driving it is the urge to have green schools. And I think that's where we find the impetus, either the school itself, maybe a parent group, maybe a regional authority, sets it up as something. We want to do this. We want our school to be green. We want recognition from the U.S. Department of Education, for example, as a green ribbon school, or we want we want our school to be green because we believe in sustainability and we want to reduce our environmental footprint. Those kinds of things are probably actually more influential than compliance with law or statute right now. In Michigan, school IPM has been the requirement for 15 or 20 years, and so they're all used to it in Michigan. and the pesticide professionals, they all practice IPM in the School of Michigan. In fact, there's I don't know if you might have ever heard or met Bob Stoddard. His business is all about IPM in schools, and so the whole western half of Michigan gets pest control services that are almost exclusively IPM. So Michigan's been at it for a while, and of course their program is getting some more funding recently, so they're probably cooking with gas among our 6 states. And in Illinois, it's been the law for a long time as well. But in Illinois, I would say it's a little bit more pro forma. Is a sort of a check the box effort. Let's make sure we have this in case something comes up.
Great. Yeah. And I do know Bob Stoddard, his company, I believe, is Green Shield certified. So
yeah. Yeah, and I don't think any of our schools or any of our states where we thumb our nose at the requirements for IPM, but I think it's probably a little bit more institutionalized in Michigan and Illinois than it is in other states.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned kind of getting complaints about parents. Are the complaints about the pesticides or the pests, or is it both? Just want clarification.
It's usually about the pests.
Okay.
The calls that I have gotten recently, and I don't get them very often, I would say no more than once a month, would be about a pest problem in the school that, where pests have come home with the kids in the backpack, or the kids have complained about, well, I had a recent complaint about no-see-ums in the classroom, those little flying midges, biting midges that you can hardly see. There was also a report of a school with a roach problem that was not very well controlled, or not yet very well controlled. Though I usually get complaints about the pests. I have not gotten complaints about pesticide exposure in the schools, but I would not be the one they would call first in that case. Typically, what you would do is you'd call the state if you had a pesticide exposure complaint.
Yeah, and for these schools that are adopting IPM, and as we see more schools adopt IPM or just pest management in general, have you found a large obstacle to increase demand or increase adoption of school IPM? If so, what would be that obstacle?
Well, the school administrators have a lot of competing concerns, and actually the foremost concern on the facility angle these days is security. Because of incidents in schools and kids with weapons and there were lots of tragedy upon tragedy in the past 20 years. Most facility concerns are about security. And so pest management sort of gets pushed way down when we're concerned about kids getting shot. and that's no exaggeration. I've had that conversation with administrators. So from a facility, when you ask a school administrator their priorities, the first is always academic performance. They are concerned about how are their kids doing, how are their standardized test scores, are they getting placed into colleges that, are they being recognized for their academic excellence? Academic performance is huge. The second thing would be staffing. There seems to be never quite enough funding for schools to get the facilities or the staffing that they like. And so it's always about how are we funding the activities that you want us to do? And then the third is security. How do we keep our kids safe? And it varies from district to district. Sometimes the hazards are more prominent in some places than others, but you can have risks all over. And so some of the expenditures that we've seen recently are oriented to security more than anything else. Now, I would say that in the past 2 or 3 years, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Recovery Act, they have all had grant programs for districts to improve their facilities, and not just for security. So we are seeing some of that. We're seeing some rising interest in the quality of the educational facility, and that would include pest management. And that's recent, but it takes a while for that to take hold. Once those funds are available from the Department of Education, it takes a while for to be distributed to states, and then it takes a while for bids to be awarded, bids to be solicited and contracts awarded and all that. So we'll see some of that. Some of that is just getting underway. Some of those facility improvements that would sort of involve pest management.
Yeah, I'm interested. Obviously, I understand that the cost constraints for schools. I work with a lot of them. We work with a lot of them for Pest Defense, and Midwest Grows Green I think a lot of the time I use data from the EPA with the cost effectiveness of IPM, but
Mm-hmm.
my knowledge that is outdated, might be all the way to 2011. I'm interested in, you might not know, is there any other work that's trying to do the cost evaluation for IPM or school IPM? If so, where would we be able to find those resources? Is it with the EPA or somebody else?
I think the EPA has not been doing that active analysis recently, but I would say that the Harvard University School of Public Health has probably the latest and greatest compendium of healthy learning environments, so to speak, of all the things that you can do, IPM among them. This is what you can do that will improve these improvements you'll make, and here's the cost that that may be involved, and here's the return in terms of academic performance. Harvard has done a really good job of assembling and that body of data, and perhaps even doing the research themselves if they haven't been able to find it someplace else. The other place that does this is the Center for Green Schools, which is a unit of the U.S. Green Building Council, USGBC. They have a body of data that sort of explains the cost benefit of healthy facilities. And we consider a series of things in healthy school facilities, not just IPM. We look at temperature and humidity and security and air quality, for example, ventilation. And IPM is part of that. Other chemical exposures, we want to minimize those, so that's why you see green cleaning, small chemicals, small quantities of chemicals in the laboratories. There's a whole spectrum of things that we do to minimize chemical exposure in the classroom. But the point is, if your kids are healthy and they're attending school, they will perform better. If they are out of school, if they're missing class because of asthma, because of other illnesses or symptoms, and they're not in class, then they're not learning. So we can make the case, and we have good research, that investments in healthy learning environments pay back in terms of academic performance. All of that has been turned upside down by the COVID pandemic, and everybody's now recovering from having been behind. I mean, we had this issue when we did the grant in Madison and again in Milwaukee, where, well, our kids aren't in school right now because they're learning from home, right? But assuming that everybody's back now, I think you'll see a resurgence of investments in healthy learning environments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is, I kind of maybe out of left field, but you just mentioned the COVID pandemic. And when we saw at the start of COVID, the very first thing that people did is just extreme sanitation and stuff like that. Has that
Right.
kind of affected the school IPM space in any practices? Because, yes, being clean is a essential part for IPM. We understand that, but some of these chemicals probably weren't suggested for cleaning in general for IPM. I'm just kind of interested if that kind of changed the school IPM space at all from your perspective.
It's the same. Some of the same principles apply. Disinfectants, are basically antimicrobial pesticides, and so they are all labeled just the same way other pesticides are. And every one of them has a keep out of reach of children label. And so we had issues with the white canisters of wipes, disinfectant wipes. And this is just an example, but you would get a supply list from your classroom, and might involve bringing in addition to your crayons and your pencils and rulers and things, bringing in a box of Kleenex that goes into the teacher's closet, and bringing in a canister of wipes that also goes into the teacher's closet, so that in a classroom, an average classroom of 25 or 30 kids, you've got a year's worth of supplies available, right? So all those canisters look basically alike, but the ones that you would use on your face and hands are one product. They're regulated by the FDA. And the ones that you would use on a surface, like your desk, like the counters or the drinking fountain or other surfaces in the schoolroom, those are regulated by EPA, and all of those are keep out of the reach of children. But they're in the same white canister. And so what we had was sort of a misuse situation in the classroom, because we want to keep everything clean. We wanted to keep surfaces clean between classes. We would ask kids to wipe their desks, wipe their own desks for the next kid. And they really shouldn't be doing that if they're using an EPA disinfectant. That's really should be used by grown-ups. We do not have any disinfectant products that can be used by kids. But if you use an FDA wipe, that's not potent enough for your surface. It's not going to hurt your hands or your face or wherever else you wipe things off, but it's not strong enough for the surface. So what we had was, don't use a disinfectant wipe on yourself first, and then don't use your personal wipe on a surface. And that was there's a lot of tension surrounding that issue, because kids shouldn't be disinfecting their own classrooms. That's a grown-up job. So we did have some issue in the classroom, but we coached people on the right use, on the how to use disinfectants properly. And the CDC was a little bit behind the curve. They had instructions for schools. They had some detailed instructions. They were too elaborate. They got quashed by political influence to some degree. You'll get different stories from different people about that, but what we saw in terms of drafts and what ended up coming out final wasn't really sufficient, partly because the CDC was in a position, they didn't want to have to bring bad news. They didn't want to have to create, they didn't want to overinvest in a risk story. So that was part of the issue there as well. But once the CDC made the shift to airborne transmission as opposed to surface transmission, we were able to back off a little bit, because we don't have to sweat the surface disinfectants now. And now airborne infection control is a different animal. We do license some devices and some products for that purpose, but they are very limited in number and not widely used and not available to people who aren't applicators or contractors. So when we had that shift in COVID to airborne transmission, the IPM issue became a lot less prominent. Now it's an indoor air issue, but we have infrastructure for indoor air.
Yeah, and I would be remiss not to mention this, because we've been following this, and you're with the EPA. One of the major things that the EPA does is approve products and the labels. And there was a hearing period, an open comment period for the proposed restrictions on rodenticides. I don't know if you have any updates on that, or if you're able to. If not, that's fine. I just wanted to see if you had any more information, because I know that's the comment period is done, but that it finished in February or so, right?
Right, and it did, and it got an enormous number of comments, and most of the comments had to do with environmental issues with predators, and predators having non-target effects because they're eating carcasses of rodents that have been killed by rodenticides. And so the headquarters is still processing all of the comments that they got on rodenticides. I don't think we'll see any proposed decisions for a while yet. I know they're working on it, but I don't think it's ready for prime time. They did get an enormous number of comments, but they also, I mean, there were also 11. I think there were 20 rodenticides involved. 11 of them were the anticoagulants. So it was a big job to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that update. It's obviously been a big issue in the pest control industry.
Yes.
Right. Any other comments that you have? Either the future of school IPM, maybe EPA's future in IPM, or any other concerns that we didn't raise during this interview?
Well, there's a couple of things I think that, I mean, in terms of what works, I think IPM needs to be part of a larger school health program. So a facility has to have not only IPM, but it has to have other chemicals management strategies. It really needs indoor air. We need to make sure that there's no lead in their drinking water, that lead pipes have been replaced. We need to make sure that asbestos has been sealed off. We still have schools that have asbestos renovation issues, and so you end up having the possibility of exposure with asbestos use in schools. The same thing with PCBs. There are still light ballasts, electrical fixtures that have PCBs in it. For a while, PCBs was used in caulk for brick walls. So, I mean, there's still exposure issues there. School buses are a source of indoor air quality, and we have a program to retrofit school buses so that they don't pollute as much as they do. But they're still internal combustion engines, and they're still going to have emissions. So IPM needs to be part of a larger school health effort, in my estimation. The other thing I think that works is this idea of sustainability. Sustainability is a popular topic, but it's a real topic. It's an issue. We need to be able to reduce our energy consumption. We need to be able to conserve water when necessary, use only what we need. We need to minimize our chemical exposures. There's a whole series of things that we need to do. We need to bike to school and walk to school instead of drive to school. So anytime a school is willing to undertake some of that and teach their kids how to live more sustainably, IPM can be part of that. And I think that's where the future is where, either the school district, the school board, maybe in an individual school, maybe there's a champion who's gonna promote this for a while and maybe hand it off to somebody else. But those are the things I think are going to make the most difference. And then when we can recognize schools that have reduced their environmental footprint, then we're really doing well. And that's, of course, that's what the Green Ribbon Schools issue is. I think Liz Wimmer came to one of the working group committee meetings to talk about what they do in Illinois for the Illinois Green Alliance is the green schools advocate in Illinois. I think Wisconsin does the same thing through the Department of Public Instruction. Victoria, I can't remember Victoria's last name, but she has a program for Wisconsin schools sustainability as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been involved with the IPM for both Illinois and Wisconsin. And right. I think it's great to see so much IPM in the Green Ribbon schools. We think that's great potential to, as you said, motivate more schools to adopt it. And Lorelei just said it's Victoria Ryberg.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Lorelei knows my problem with name retrieval, right? I couldn't remember Ruth Kersey's name to save my life when we were talking about this. So, and and you used to work for her, so, but
Yes.
she did. She literally wrote the book on school IPM in Illinois, and I couldn't remember her name. And I went to grad school with her too. So anyway, yes, Victoria Vidberg.
Yeah.
She's the one in Wisconsin.
Mhm.
To me, that's where the future is. I think we have the research. I think we can make the case with superintendents and school boards that these investments are worth it. And we have enough. We have a body of success that we can sort of build on, but it's very incremental. I mean, it's as a district sees something happen. If a district wants to have a little competition with a neighboring district, we could be greener than you. And then, there's some districts where this is just not going to land on the priority list. It's going to be below the line because we have too much else to worry about and not enough resources. So, it is going to be it's like many things in education. It's going to be a mixed bag wherever you look, depending on where you look. So, but yeah, that's what I think the future is really IPM as part of an overall sustainability program. The other thing is, and you're probably familiar with this, is we have a pretty good idea of what goes on in the school building and what's needed to prevent pests. And I do think pest prevention is the tactic that works the best. But we don't have quite the same vigor when it comes to playing fields. Yeah, we just don't. And we have some highly treated contest playing fields for soccer and football where you have quite a bit of pesticide use and quite a bit of exposure as a result. I don't know if I saw it in my Google News feed yesterday. There's evidence that teenagers might be impacted by the excessive use of glyphosate, in their midst. And so it's like teenagers, right? And we typically concern ourselves with kids who are much younger. So there's always going to be something to be worried about too.
Yeah, there was, and we just shared it. There was research on 2,4-D and glyphosate, and I believe concerns with both of them being, I know 2,4-D neurotoxins, but glyphosate also having some health risks. There's a research.
Yeah, and glyphosate is such a mixed bag. In the quantities that we normally see it, you don't have to sweat the glyphosate. It really is a relatively benign. But when we have some large exposures, when you have like landscape workers who use it all the time, or people who are exposed by spills, then it's a whole nother story. And those acute exposures can make somebody sick. So, and people have different. Good people differ on the risk associated with glyphosate. 2,4-D is a little different animal, and when it comes to teenagers, it may have to do with the endocrine disruption. It might be that it's either mimicking a hormone or it's preventing hormones from taking effect. It might be blocking the uptake of a hormone. So that endocrine disruption is probably important with teenagers because they are in the middle of their hormones. So yeah, I haven't studied that. I just saw the headline, but I thought, oh boy, here we go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Seth. That was a lot of great information. Really appreciate you taking some time with us. As we said, this is a recorded interview. We'll probably publish a little case study from the interview in a month or so. And we'll have more information as we continue to do these interviews. So that once again, thank you, Seth, for taking the time. Appreciate it.
Glad to do it. And if you have any follow-up questions or anything I can point you to, let me know and I'll send you the links or any kind of update.
Thanks. And stop recording.